How's that? Good? Herb, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Mike Johansson, and I'd like to just introduce our guest speaker and say a few words about him. Dr. Duane DeFreese is the Executive Director of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. And I can't say enough about what Duane does for all of us. I mean, Duane is so cool. He answers his own phone. I mean, which is unheard of.
That's not cool, it's stupid.
And besides that, he calls you back, which is also amazing. So he did his undergrad work in Rhode Island and his master's and doctorate at FIT, where one of his friends and one of our former members who was off on a medical absence, Dr. John Treffery, asked me to say hi. My first experience with Duane was when I first came to Vero Beach, and I couldn't figure out where to go to solve the problem that the city had just dumped 3.5 million of raw sewage in the creek right behind my house. And I was looking, and I went through all the acronyms and the 3 letters and the MRCs and the CRTs, and I finally ended up with Duane. And Duane didn't know, he couldn't fix it, but he knew who could fix it. And that's, in this day and age, the guy who's in charge there's the guy who's got all that information. We were doing in the IRNA, we had a program, we were trying to get people, the step system in Vero Beach, the surrogate for sewage lines, getting off septic tank. We were having a big program, and we were with the realtors, and we were trying to grab what we thought was low-hanging fruit, and if you weren't converted to step by the time you sold your home, you had to convert to step within a year of selling it. And you think about this. This is a $15,000 conversion, and this is $1.5 million sale. It kind of gets lost in the shuffle, and you split it between the buyer and the seller, and it happens. And that went on, and I was dealing with Dale Sorensen, the big realtor here in the Vero Beach area. And I was one-on-one with him in his office, and he was saying, but why should I? We were having a problem with the realtors, and they didn't want to convert to this, and they would close down the closing, it would slow it down, or blah, 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 blah. So I finally said, I gave Dale the last speech I heard Duane give, and I saw the light bulb come on, and he said, I get it. If the lagoon turns into a toilet, all this waterfront real estate is not good. I said, now you got it. So Duane is the guy that we thought would come and talk with everybody. What can we do? What are we doing? And there's 2 aspects of redoing the lagoon and rehabbing it and getting it back into shape. One is the ecological, the environmental aspect of it, but the other one is the environmental impact of it, which was what I used to talk with Dale and what Duane's going to talk with us about today. So without further ado, I hope you join me in welcoming my friend, your friend, Duane DeFreese.
You can tell I'm a New Yorker. I can't stand at a podium. I have to walk and talk at the same time. So I came down to Florida 47 years ago as a grad student at Florida Institute of Technology, cut my teeth on the Indian River Lagoon and heard the stories of the old timers, and now I'm the old timer, about how amazing this lagoon used to be. I spent a lot of time with Laura Lee Thompson, Dixie Crossroads in Volusia, and Northern Brevard. Spent a lot of time with Charlie Sembler right here in town, hearing about the lagoon that was before I got here. And I came down from first New York, then Rhode Island, and still thought this was paradise. And that shifting baseline of what is good is both dangerous, and we are in a fast trajectory. So what I thought I'd do, I had promised that, number one, you've already had your cocktails, so let's have a conversation. But I want to give you kind of a speed round, not starting with the money, but starting with why the investment is important, and give you an idea of why value is more important than cost. And so with that, how many people have been here more than 30 years? Oh, a lot of you. How many are here like this is your first year in Florida? Gosh, I guess the folks in New York and Rhode Island didn't get the message in this blizzard the week. And so if you've been here 30 years, you've seen the change in 3 decades. And there's no question that 30 years ago, this was a different system, but still impaired. And so what I'd like to do, let's see if I can make go. The reason we are different is that we do not have a companion parallel system pretty much anywhere in the United States that is narrow, shallow, microtidal, which really means we don't have large flushing through our restricted inlets. And we've got a pretty radically big watershed that is different from the north to the south. And so if you look at this tiny little stretch, we're not like Puget Sound or Narragansett Bay where I can look across the water and see my neighbors. I've got to lean over. And if I'm in Volusia County, I can't imagine what's happening in Martin County. On the southern end, we've got Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades and all of the attending issues of water discharge. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. On the northern end, the watershed gets really narrow, but we've got urbanizing, and in the last 10 to 20 years, now industrial commercial growth that's largely related to aviation and aerospace. To be honest, all that's good. It's just how we manage that growth and still maintain the functionality of a system like the lagoon. And we're also socioeconomically different. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But we're also a national treasure. And so Everglades, no question, is a nationally noticed, funded program. The last number of years, we're putting $500 to $600 million a year to match $500 to $600 million, from Congress. And we're still just finally accelerating the amount of work. And Mike and I were talking, you can't do these projects without having adequate funding. And it's really hard when the funding is year to year, and every year you don't know if you're in business or not in business. And recurring funding does not occur at the government level. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But look at the federal assets, especially to the north. But we've also got national wildlife refuges. We have a national seashore. So we've got public and also DOD facilities that are nested in one of the nation's most important estuaries. And its importance, I'll figure out how to go backwards. Its importance hasn't, really been missed, but it hasn't been invested in. So when I got here 47 years ago, we were talking about nutrient pollution. We weren't so worried about harmful algal blooms, but we had algal blooms. They weren't as large, as intense, and so if you fertilize your lawn, it's going to grow, and that's what we've been doing year after year after year from multiple sources. And so when we talk about cost, investment, and value, we need to understand what's going to happen if we don't make that commitment to invest, restore, and rebuild. And so this is just a few examples of the rainbow of algal blooms that we've had since 2010, starting with the super bloom 2010-2011. Thankfully for the Indian River Lagoon, only a few of these species are known to be toxic, and usually it's shellfish, but any of you who have been around red tide know, and also if you ever go in the summer on one of the tourist bioluminescence, if you have COPD, you're going to be feeling that aerosol. So toxicity is something we worry about. It's not just about environment, it's not just about economics, it's about human and community health. And on the southern end, this is really interesting. Don't put technology in the hands of an old marine biologist. Give me a fishing pole. So this is what it looks like when Lake Okeechobee is discharging at 9 million gallons a day. Besides the salinity, which is a pollutant in itself, so we're putting all this fresh water down into an estuary at massive volumes and at massive velocities, but we're also bringing cyanobacteria. And I took those pictures. This is back in 2018, and we've had 2013, 2016, 2018. My lungs hurt for 60 days just taking those pictures, not knowing the neurological and health implications. We had a number of people's dogs, pets, died just by drinking water. And so this is not just an environmental issue. And so when we start to think about the impacts on the environment, in 2010 we had the super bloom, which was green. Amazingly enough, we still don't know what that was. It was a cyanobacteria that has no name yet, and we don't know whether it's toxic or not. And we watched seagrasses begin to fall right after 2010, had a little bit of a rebound in 15 and 16, catastrophic fish kill up around Cocoa, both in the Indian River, Banana River. Tourism was going crazy, probably had hundreds of thousands of fish dead on the water. And we had the following impact, manatee deaths, including an unusual mortality event. And we are still feeling some of those events as it moves up the food chain, because when you lose that many seagrasses, 43,000 acres, it was like over 80% of coverage. But think about what 32,575 football fields would be looking like. If you had that kind of acreage and you were a farmer and you lost it all, you're not only out of business, but you're probably not getting back in business because of the impacts. And so we, at that time, and I mean the collective we of scientists, resource managers, weren't only just in a panic, but we were in a depression because we had hit what we call a tipping point. And then that tipping point became a regime shift all the way to 2020. And I'm going to show you some good news at the end. But we have been responding to that impact. And that response has been a challenge for scientists, for resource managers, for tourism entities, especially mom and pop operations that depend on clean water to do their work. And it's all because we have a plumbing problem. And this plumbing problem started decades ago, started with communities that felt like if there wasn't a catastrophic problem with your wastewater treatment plant, or it was cheaper to put in a traditional septic, you just went that route. And so we kicked the can down the road on water and wastewater and stormwater advanced treatment for decades. And now we find ourselves trying to catch up 40 years of old infrastructure, 40 years of infrastructure that's under capacity, and then all that's happening from that land. That's how Mike and I first got. The pollution that's in the system is largely muck, which is both a water quality issue, but also a nutrient issue. And so we're in the process of fixing the problem, but it's not cheap, and I'm going to show you. And so I love this quote. And normally I would never quote an elected official, partly because it's dangerous, and partly because if you've got one side of the political aisle, the other side gets mad. But this one, I haven't been able to let go. I was, in a public hearing down in Martin County on Lake Okeechobee, the LOSM, the lake operating schedule, and Congressman Brian Mast said this quote, if I wouldn't put it in the bathtub with my kids, why would we put it in surface waters? And it turns out that wasn't just a one-shot deal. I've heard him say it numerous times. And last year I was actually introducing him, at the House Congressional Caucus for Estuaries. And there wasn't any questions. And I thought, I'm going to quote him now. And I thought, I'm taking a big chance. But he remembered. He has been one of our staunchest, most vocal elected officials for Everglades restoration and water in the state of Florida. And that's just a fact. It's not a political statement. So we got to fix where all these problems are coming from. And again, it's plumbing. And so when we start to look at those challenges and look around the United States, the question is, what's the role of a national estuary program? And what are we doing here? So after 25 years of the National Estuary Program for the Lagoon actually being managed through the St. Johns River Water Management District, I was hired in 2015 to basically shepherd a reorganization. A IRL council was formed, and I'll show you that, but how we operate, and I get this every day, and I got it when I was coming in, how come we don't see you, with the advocates? We don't advocate. Our job is to collaborate, coordinate, communicate, build community, vision, and then we let the folks like the association, you have that advocacy capability, but I can't work in the space that we work in with local, state, and federal government, and then try to get the funding we need for infrastructure, and at the same time, next week, we're going to be at the mic, pointing fingers at somebody who thinks they're the big enemy. So I have a good friend, Frank Catino, Captain Frank Catino, 50 years guiding in Brevard County. And Frank goes, if you want to see the enemy, look in the mirror. We all have impacts, whether it's here, on our lawns, in our backyards, with our plumbing. And so our job with an NEP is to bring it all together. So when I got hired, we completely restructured underneath the IRL Council. Let me just quickly show you what that looks like in the beginning and today. The first thing was an interlocal agreement, which increased significantly our recurring funding commitment with $500,000 each from the two water management districts, $250,000 from DEP, $50,000 each from the counties. Indian River County was a little slow to come to the table in the very beginning. We had 3 cities, Fellsmere, Vero Beach, and Sebastian actually picked up that $50,000 and said, we'll keep paying until the county comes to the table. And they did quickly because they saw we weren't a threat and they saw we weren't another layer of bureaucracy, that our job was to get the job done. And the council board of directors has said that now for the last 10 years. Do the work. We don't have a lot of money, but make it work. And so that is our basic funding each year. And then we leverage that out, and we leverage it through a kind of a structure that none of you have seen in government before, and definitely not in the private sector. It's called collaborative governance business model. And we basically have now over 100 volunteers, scientists, citizens, industry leaders, community leaders, innovators, who meet every quarter in 3 different committees and a 4th subcommittee, looking at the finances, looking at the science, looking at the management. They decide the work plan every single year. Not me, not my staff. We facilitate their collective governance, and then every quarter, that business model, that decision goes up to the board of directors, and it all happens in the same week. So if you want to have fun, come join us at one of those meetings. They're all up, at the old schoolhouse at the city of Sebastian. But those individuals, for the most part, have been meeting for 10 years. A little bit of turnover, but I say this without any data, just my gut after all these years. I don't think there's a collaborative governance, science, and management structure anywhere in the state, and probably not the eastern coast of the United States, this robust, this dedicated, and no question, this smart. And they come, they do the work, and they argue like crazy when they need to, but we always leave that room with a consensus. And what we realized early was, with all those scientists and engineers and smart business leaders, it wasn't experience and intelligence. We just weren't working together. We have 38 incorporated cities who don't talk to each other for the most part. 7 counties in the watershed. You forget Okeechobee County has a chunk of this watershed. And all of these entities were going to Tallahassee and Washington alone, with their own lobbyists, and you never ever had the political leverage or the economic and community leverage that we have now. And so we came up with this mission statement: one lagoon, one community, one voice. We can disagree, and of course the priorities in Indian River County, I can tell you, are way different than Brevard, but we make sure we're helping each other. And I was just in Tallahassee for 4 days, and I carry all those municipalities. They tell me what they want, and I can't lobby, but when I get asked, I'm able to responsibly and intelligently say, they're working really hard. This would be a good project if you decide to fund it. So let's take a look at, kind of how we get there. So we do have a plan. It's a 10-year plan. That management conference created the plan. We won't revise it unless there's a compelling business reason that it doesn't work. But we are mandated every 10 years by the EPA, who funds the National Estuary Program, to take a hard look to see if we're still well positioned. That plan has 32 vital signs. And unlike a lot of environmental groups, we've got the normal water quality, habitat quality, biological resources on the top end in blue, but we're also looking at communities like Vero Beach, like Fellsmere, and so this whole lower unit is all about socioeconomic value, and resilience, and embedded in that are commitments to not only economics, but finding funds to help our partners and leverage the power of an NEP, that collective power, to find money. And what's in red are the 6 areas where our scientists and managers said, these 6 areas are not only critically urgent, but let's focus our investments there. If you get money, for example, climate change, it wasn't like a driver, an immediate driver back in 19, but we had money back then. And so we did work in resilience and climate change. So this is what we look like after 10 years. Not a small amount of investment. And this is not the matching dollars. This is IRL Council, federal, state, local money going to projects. Every one of those projects goes through a rigorous, comprehensive review by our committee. Mike has sat through those long meetings where we're ranking and reviewing. But my staff doesn't touch those proposals. All we do is handle the assembly. So we have somewhere between 15 and 16 volunteers from the management conference that'll work through each of these categories, vertically rank from top to bottom, and then we fund from top to bottom until our money runs out. And sadly, we have way more projects than we have money. But when you think about 267 projects, almost $30 million. My staff for the first 5 years was 3. My staff now is 8. And the 8th is only here because we have a contract. We're managing, on average, over 40 contracts a year. And the federal ones are, anybody ever do work with the feds? Try to get a federal business loan? The paperwork is insane. We spend more time pushing paper with the feds than actually doing the work. And I thought you might be interested because all the elected officials go, well, how much did my county or we don't do it at the city level, but you have that data. And this is my message to not only Vero Beach, I was with the commission yesterday. If you don't ask for money, you don't get money. And so you can't be shy in this competitive world. And this goes for the association as well. If you're a nonprofit and you're doing good work, you should be looking at our grant program, including our small grants, anywhere from $500 to $5,000. But if you don't put a proposal in, we can't help you. And we don't have nearly enough proposals. In fact, in restoration this year, we had 0 for the first time ever. Some of that is that there's a lot of money on the street. So let's start talking about where we go on the big picture of economics. I came from industry when I took this job, and it was a high-tech, it wasn't startup, it was early phase company. Angel investors, about 20 million invested over the 8 or 9 years before I was hired. They got a fairly large grant to prove a technology to basically take cyanobacteria out of Lake Jesup, treat that water to standard and beyond standard, and then turn the biosolids into JP8 jet fuel with grants, with aviation and UOP lab, which we did. The sad part of that story is that company never commercialized. And I learned a lot in that kind of wild world of, being in a startup company. You can have a bright idea, but getting that idea to the market, it's not easy. And when your market's government, it's doubly hard because you can't trust that that money is going to be there because it's political. So we had 5 years of proven technology, a $3 million water treatment facility, and we had to bulldoze it all because we couldn't get that second renewable contract from a state agency who said it was a renewable contract. And so when I got to this job, the normal products after a CCMP is a monitoring plan, it's a communication plan. We're working on a habitat restoration plan, which we've held back on. But I didn't want to do one of these, what I would call, restaurant menus where $1 sign is cheap, less than 50,000. $5 signs was in the millions, but you had no idea of cost. So we actually went, and this was internal. We did not bring in support until we were down the line. We went and called every agency, every nonprofit, every local government and said, what projects do you have kind of on your wish list for 5 and 10 years? We went to the agency, and some of them have really good strategic plans, water management districts. And we basically assembled that one line of, let's just call it a census of who had projects. And you can see it was well over 1,000 projects came to us. Not all of them were good. In fact, some of them were just concepts. But we said, let's look at the marketplace of need. I wasn't comfortable coming from industry that that was good enough. So we talked to the counties in the state and said, at the time we were thinking 300,000 traditional septics in the watershed. At that time, and remember, this isn't that long ago, a decade ago, it was $10,000 to convert a septic if you had access to a sewer line. It's triple to quadruple that now. But that was a line of evidence. And then the other line of evidence that we used was talking to our partners who had done a lot of this work. And so we came out, with $4 to $6 billion in infrastructure needs. Almost all of that is in wastewater, stormwater, septic, muck dredging, what I would call the plumbing projects that would reduce pollutants and nutrients. And the first thing when EPA saw that report, they said, do you want to go public with that? And the worry was that if you actually put the costs on the table, that everybody was going to recoil and say, we'll never be able to afford that. And in fact, we heard that a lot. We still hear it now. Oh, it's too expensive. We can't afford it. And that storyline, which actually I heard in Tallahassee last week, tells me that that individual, no matter where they come from, they're thinking about costs, but they're not thinking about benefits. And they're definitely not thinking about long-term value to us as citizens, the state of Florida, and our communities. So we actually had this vetted by an environmental group that focuses just on economic analysis, the Balmoral Group. And they were so good, and they actually wrote a definitive memorandum that said, you know, the National Estuary Program wasn't pulling these numbers out of the air. There was enough money in the marketplace to do this work, that the work can be done with the right public, you know, investment, public trust. And no question, the sooner you do it, the cheaper it's going to be. Because the time value of money, we're seeing that right now. And so, you know, this look I get, including last week, you know, I look at Kennedy Space Center. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And I think about the hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars we're spending on going to space. This is a drop in the bucket to protect Earth and protect our communities. And the technology is here. We don't need, you know, massive expansion in technology, although technology will definitely cut the costs and increase the timeline. And I'm going to show you some examples. So where have we been the last 10 years? I hate to tell you, but we've had what I would call the gold standard of a decade. And I don't think we're going to have it again in the next decade, but I hope I'm wrong. So we had two massive federal infrastructure bills, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the National Estuary Programs combined through our association, and we're able to not only get a line item in that budget, but hold it, which was over $130 million to be distributed evenly through the NEPs. And so each of us got $909,800 annually for 5 years. And that was new money. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act, which no longer exists. It wasn't bipartisan, it was an executive order, but that was supposed to be focused on energy, coastal resilience, you know, communities that were struggling. I don't know whether either one of those federal programs come back with another name, but we didn't get the work done on the national level. And I, you know, I will say this, I say it a lot, I don't care whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. You know, we can't do the projects if we don't have the money to do the work, and it's not cheap. But I'm going to show you where those values are. And then we chased competitive grants for the first time in the history of the NEP. And I'll show you how we succeeded with that. But we also had the state of Florida. And I was just up there. I'm going to give the state summary in South Carolina next week on coastal resilience with North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. And we were slow to the game investing in resilience. And we were slow to the game investing in water infrastructure. The last 10 years, under Governor DeSantis, we're not slow anymore. $9 billion. Actually, it's over $9 billion without this session. And that money has gone to work. And then in 23, so Senator Mayfield pushed through the Clean Waterways Act in 20. The House, the Senate, the governor said we need to have a program looking at coastal resilience. As of last week, I think only 2 or 3 counties don't have a vulnerability plan. So they're all eligible for funding for resilience. And then the Indian River Lagoon Protection Program was an executive order in 23 from DeSantis, and the governor promised that in his budget he would have $100 million a year each year for the last 4 years for the Indian River Lagoon. The House and the Senate delivered on the governor's promise in year 1. Delivered again in year 2. Last year, no big surprise, the Love Fest, you know, up in Tallahassee start to unravel. House came in at 0, Senate came in at 25. They reconciled at 25 million, but that's 25 million more than I ever saw, you know, coming from the state for the Indian River Lagoon. This year, the governor's budget had 100 million to be divided between Indian River Lagoon and Biscayne Bay. I haven't had a chance to look at the House budget and the Senate budget. If you've ever done that, it's not fun. And I'm getting so old I can't read it even with a magnifying glass. I'm hoping we're in the tens of millions. I don't think we need to be greedy, but we need to keep the progress. And then what happens next year with a new governor and a lot of changes in Tallahassee and Washington, we're going to be dealing with a lot of new faces. But this has been a remarkable 10 years that I feel actually blessed to have been here to see the progress. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we took that to heart. And we said, you know what, seagrasses are a critical issue. Let's not just do, one-off projects. We took half of that money and put it into 5 years of funding for 5 seagrass nurseries that are all in production right now. So down at Florida Oceanographic Society, Harbor Branch, just down the road, we have a private sector company who does commercial seagrass restoration, sea and shoreline. We've got Brevard Zoo in Brevard County, and we have Marine Discovery Center. And I said then, and I'll say it now, we are not going to plant our way to 40,000+ acres of seagrass, and we are planting. It's happening as we speak. It's going to help accelerate recovery. The key to a healthy lagoon starts with the plumbing, starts with water quality, nutrient reduction, and water clarity. And Mike would be mad at me if I didn't say this, but it includes muck dredging. Brevard County, it's ugly, it's expensive, there's all sorts of difficulties on how you manage, but if you get that fine muck out of the high spots, you're going to see dramatic changes in nutrient loads that are internal from decades of what comes off our stormwater systems. And so the other part of this, which I hope, because I'm still a scientist, although I don't brag about it because I'm not a smart scientist anymore, these young kids are, they've got seagrasses flowering and seeding in these nurseries. So imagine, instead of outplanting, if we can figure out how to accelerate flowers and seeds, then we become like Johnny Appleseed, and they're doing that in Australia, Europe, and also Australia. Sad thing is our seagrasses are a lot more stubborn than theirs. So some of these plants, you get 3 seeds. But that's happening right now. So the research, the technology, understanding seagrasses in the environment, that work is happening because we built infrastructure with the federal dollar. We also went to NOAA. NOAA had money. They had 3 calls, we call them NOFOs. And to be honest, no partner along this lagoon, not water management districts, not our counties, could put together any kind of a project that NOAA Fisheries would have looked at and said, this is transformational. So the first year we attempted, we had multiple partners. I think we were asking for 12 or 15 million. They came back and they weren't convinced because we were trying to convince them to do something different. So not 100 acres or 500 acres of oyster reef in the Panhandle or the Gulf of Mexico or giant fish reefs. We said the transformational piece of this is the human assets. So we're going to propose doing multiple sites with multiple partners. Not any one of these single sites is transformational alone. And we made our case. The first year they wanted economic analysis, and many of the environmental communities and universities said, we don't think that's a good idea. We didn't listen to that because we thought it was a great idea. We were looking for funding to update the 2016 economic study. So we warned them. We said, we're going to put some money in this, but we're going to match it with our EPA money in a way you haven't seen. And so the only way these 2 efforts could have happened is because we have a national estuary program, because we can build that coalition, and we are much stronger together than we are alone. And so you can see we've got seagrasses, oyster reefs, clams, fish passage. I'm going to show you where that's happening because it's close to here. We've got innovation happening right in Indian River County with the assemblers who are doing Spartan reef, little patch reefs. We had to fight to keep that in the project. We wanted 12 sites. These patch reefs would be underneath the dock. and nobody saw the value. And finally, we convinced them, let us do 3 as pilots. They went ahead and allowed the funding, and then Brevard Zoo put one under a private dock with permits, and the videos of the fish assemblage was so amazing. We sent it up to NOAA, and the NOAA fisheries people went, we need to do a video. We need to get this video around. It's gone all over. And how many of you fish? Are down here and you fish a lot? The bottom line on fishing, fish like structure. And we've lost a lot of structure. And we took a little bit of a hit from some of the younger environmentalists who said, you know, that investment isn't a good investment because it's artificial. It's not artificial. And if you call me, I can send you pictures from the late 1800s, early 1900s. We used to have coquina reefs and coquina shorelines all over this system. It wasn't uniform, but we had a lot of hard structure. And the really good recreational guides, they know where some of those submerged reefs still are, but they won't give me latitudes and longitudes. We're training the next generation with interns, but we're also training volunteers. And I want to just mention this. Over 2,400 just in this project, but if I add the volunteers over the last 10 years that have supported oyster restoration at University of Central Florida and Brevard Zoo's Restore Our program, Restore Our Shores, I don't know what the count is, you know, with Orca, with Edie, but it's a lot. But we're talking close to probably, I'm going to say conservatively, 80 to 90,000 volunteers in the water doing work because they want to. And the kids become advocates. Some of them become engineers and marine biologists. You know, if you want to get wet, you want to get dirty, and you want to do something that you leave needing a beer and needing a nap, you know, go help any of these organizations, including the Land Trust here, on some of these projects. So I want to show you 2 that are here, local. I'm not going to show you all of these. They're all in some level of play. But this is one that's done. So Indian River County wanted some fairly sizable seagrass restoration. So we had one site at Preacher's Hole and another at Big Slough. You can see the acreage. That outplanting is done. They're monitoring now. NOAA wants 3 years of monitoring, which in my opinion is not enough, but that's what they'll fund. And so that is one of the first completed projects in this 3-year program. And we've got some shoreline projects up north. The other one is just ramping up. And many of you either know or maybe help the Indian River Land Trust. And they've got some unbelievably outstanding, you know, not only facilities, but resources as they have built that land trust inventory of wetlands. And so they came to us and said, we'd like to upgrade Bee Gum Marsh, you know, get more culverts in for fish passage, do some, you know, breakwall, you know, reefs so we don't have damage every time we have a storm on that mosquito impoundment. So in the next 2 weeks, they'll start putting culverts in. And remember, we're in middle of year 2. It's taken us this long to get permits for a lot of this stuff, including federal NEPA review. And so when they close down federal government, we're sitting and waiting. You would think if you're doing restoration, it'd be easy. I tell everybody, I get a permit faster for a 9-story condominium than I do for a patch reef. And so these are the 2 that are working. And neither one of these projects in Indian River County would be able to get funding if it was just them alone in the project. So what is this all worth? So we looked, and because we've worked with the Balmoral Group and we have them under a service contract when we need economic services, we called them up and said, be a partner in this proposal with us. And doing long-term deep dives in economic value is not easy, and it's not inexpensive if you get a really good firm. And so we had deliverables, which are all online, and I've got an executive summary you can take home along with our annual report back there. We said we don't want to just do economic output. We did that in 2016, and I'll just tell you, there were 2 independent studies in 2016. One was the regional planning councils, and they said the economic value of the Indian River Lagoon was $7.6 billion, and every dollar you put in restoration will return $33. And this isn't cash return, this is value. Brevard County did the same with their Save Our Indian River Lagoon sales tax, and theirs was a total different methodology. They were using net present value, and in fact, both of them weren't really looking at real estate and some of the other direct values. They had $6 billion for Brevard, and if I remember correctly, 22 to 1. So when we rolled out this research, eyes not only rolled, but questions came up. How could that be that different? And it's about scale. Ours is all 7 counties. Ours was looking at ecosystem services. We were also looking at real estate. We were looking at jobs, and not just jobs like commercial and recreational fishing. We were looking at jobs that have a direct connection to the Indian River Lagoon. And there's one group you wouldn't think of, but for Northrop Grumman, SpaceX, L3 Harris, all of those young engineers and geniuses want to live in a place that is really cool, where they can have a boat, maybe raise their kids on a house either near or on the water. This is a workforce attraction and retention issue that we've worked very closely with the Economic Development Commission to get a handle on how much that matters. So we gave the Balmoral Group a very heavy, charge. And then we said, we're going to need this in a year. And they went, well, you got 3 years of funding. How come we can't go to 2017? And I rolled out what I was talking to you about. Changing governor, changing economy, changing administration. A year ago in Washington, I said, I need updated dollars. So when I'm making the case of why invest, I've got some economic, data to support my position and our position. So this is available. We're making it available to everybody. And this is the ecosystem service piece. And I pulled this picture because I was in this rainstorm when it hit. This is one of those, you can talk what's causing climate change. The fact is climate is changing. That's a scientific fact. And the fact is these bomb rainfall events aren't like 1 in 100 years. We're having them all the time. This was a 17-inch rain that I drove through from, our office in Sebastian. And I've driven through some really bad storms, including 2 hurricanes. I've never seen anything like that. Look at the flooding in Fellsmere. We see this now with high tides all through the state of Florida. Our infrastructure isn't ready for the new weather and for the increased intensity, frequency, and duration of storms. And you see that kind of lack of adaptation and preparation all the way up the East Coast with northeasters, with floods. We are challenged because our infrastructure was built 30, 40 years ago, and it wasn't built for the conditions today. And so we asked the Balmoral Group, quantify ecosystem services, and don't, go outside of the normal marketplace. My team and almost every young person and scientist I know, they all talk about, carbon credits. We're not doing carbon credits in the state of Florida. I'm sure it's going to happen. They're doing it in Europe, but it's not a commodity that anybody's going to listen to in the business or the policy world. So we got really conservative. They said, should we bring agriculture into this? And we said, yeah, agriculture is just far enough off the lagoon itself, and I'm sure some of the ag folks, but what's happened with citrus. Let's leave that one off. Let's be uber conservative in these estimates. And so you've got the executive summary. All of these reports are online. One of them, is over on the table, the economic, but there's also a dashboard. So if you want to go play and move numbers around, especially with some of the county, socioeconomic, that is kind of in beta testing. So if you test it and it's not working, let us know. We're working with Balmoral, but we wanted to get it out. So what do the numbers look like? And this will be, so if you look at the whole watershed and you think about where floodwaters need and have to go, and pushing it all into the Indian River Lagoon is not the solution. That's the issue we're dealing with now. We've got over 940,000 acres in the watershed of natural lands and ag lands, and all of them either retain or will use rainfall, and they can hold 100 billion gallons of floodwater annually. So if you lose that natural and agricultural land, it's going down the drain or going down the street or going to a lake. It's not going where you want it. We have 52,500 acres of natural lands that are actually providing coastal protection. Could be mangroves, it could be shoreline buffers, but it's a large acreage. We have 368,000 acres of land that's actually wetlands that filter water, slow it down before it hits surface waters. And then you've got these kind of public uses, the aesthetics, all of the tourism and recreational values. And we went back and worked with Balmoral and said, let's drill this down because we can. And we had hard numbers from NOAA. We knew what each one of those projects were going to cost in a budgeted cost estimate. And so if you roll out ecosystem services through these multiple buckets of value and use, everything from, recreational boating, fishing, and shoreline, which is the largest component. In the middle, we've got water quality, habitat quality, urban flood risks, coastal protection, commercial fishing. This is a sad story. When I got here, back in '78, clams, finfish, shrimping, those were multi-million-dollar commercial industries that almost don't exist anymore. So we lost that capacity already with bad water quality, and we're seeing the last generation of domestic commercial fishers in the Indian River Lagoon. And now, of course, our fishing guides are struggling because at one point they'd have people from all over the world come for redfish, snook, tarpon, and it's a tough day now. They used to count on spotted sea trout because it was, if you had a slow day with everything, you could count on a couple good trout. They're working hard to give a good day to a guide, for a guide to give a client and then have them come back. Look at the total, $10 billion in ecosystem services annually. That's the ecosystem service value. And then we said, drill it one more level. So they took each of the sites that we had, ran output analysis with a model called InPlan. So if you look at the total output of the Indian River Lagoon economically, $28.3 billion. And the only difference, it's not like we're in better shape now than 2016. 2016 economic studies were limited in scope and what they looked at for value. And this was comprehensive. 14 billion value add to GDP, 8.3 billion in wages, 128,400 jobs.
Hey, Duane?
Yeah.
Your mic cut out.
You guys can hear me, can't you? All right. That's the New Yorker in me. Too many baseball and football games. And so you can see how they leveraged kind of that analysis, because I wanted you to know that they weren't just picking these roll-up numbers out of thin air. They actually had data, they had models, and they are experts in this. And then we looked at our sites, and we said, wouldn't it be cool if we looked at all of these different restoration sites? Some were a single habitat, and some of them were more complicated, like bee gum, where you're doing seagrasses, oysters, shoreline, And so we instructed and decided with Balmoral's guidance, let's not pick the best, biggest return on investment. Let's find middle ground on those multiple species sites. And then some, like right here, Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, that is a 2,000 acre reconnection where the dike tops are completely being leveled. So that 2,000 acres is now at high tide a fully functional wet marsh. And I bring that one up in particular because you can't take these numbers and say, well, every single wetland site's going to be that benefit cost ratio. Yes?
You're saying they took the dikes out at Merritt Island?
Yes. This is one.
How does the Space Center
The Space Center's got 143,000 acres. There's all sorts of mosquito impoundments. And so Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge and NASA recognize that with the commercial industrial growth, we're going to need to start to optimize some of these habitats. And I can tell you, it wasn't easy to get all those letters of support and permits, but that is now a functional wetland in high tide. You can see the return on investment, but here's the cool story about technology. And I hope it happens with septic tanks. In construction for 30 years, they've been doing LiDAR, and basically you put equipment, leveling equipment, instead of having a survey crew come out, now they've got it on the dirt moving equipment. So if I'm an operator, I don't have to move dirt and then have a survey crew come in to see if I hit my elevation. They're doing it real time. That project came in at half the cost. And so we called NOAA and said, we don't want to give money back. So they're moving down that dike right now, permits, to see if they can double the amount of value of that system. If you look at clams, you'll say, clams, you know, why is that so high compared to seagrasses? Well, clams, you know, are not labor intensive, not technology intensive, and the relative cost to value is low. So you shouldn't compare these one-to-one because this isn't a value comparison. We wanted to be able to go back to NOAA Fisheries and basically say, you gave us 9.4 million, this is your return on investment. And the average return on investment is 24 times. And if I take the two big ones out, it's 10 times. And if any of us was starting a business and we had a 10-time return on investment, we'd be saying, let's go for it. And so this is now on the street. And last two slides, I don't need science, but science is always good to back up a story. But don't believe me when I say the Indian River Lagoon is getting better. It's getting cleaner. It's a slow process, and it's an expensive process. But the data is backing this up. This was the harmful algal blooms, you know, in 3 of the basins back in 2010, 2011, and moving, you know, into 21, when we really started to invest money. So harmful algal blooms, they're happening right now. In fact, I'm really worried that this freeze is going to kick us into a bad situation with so much biomass back in the system, including dead fish. But there's no question that when you put investments in projects, whether it's muck dredging, shoreline restoration, and especially the plumbing, you are going to see results. And that water column change, fewer blooms, less intense. The big one is less long lasting and smaller, so they're patchy, has resulted in this. So since 2021, we are seeing, and we are guardedly optimistic. I don't know if this trend line is likely to hold, but we are seeing seagrasses coming back in a lot of locations. Some places it's robust, some places it's very sparse, but we're at the very beginning of recovery. And that's what it looks like when it's looking good. It's like the old days. Trout love it, snook love it, I love it, you know, and Everybody wants that if you're living on the water. And there are two really what I would call transformational projects that are in progress right now. There's a lot of great projects in Indian River County. County has really stepped up, but these are really big projects that change the game. Fort Pierce Utilities is moving the power plant right as we speak to the mainland. It's a $130+ million move, and it's been 20 years to get here. But they are, basically getting ready to start flowing sewage to the mainland. And of course, this high-value property, the big discussion is going to be, what to do with it. Now that you've got waterfront property, with, right on the lagoon. But you can see how vulnerable that would be in a Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5 hurricane. We have a lot of wastewater treatment plants like that are right at the edge of going in the water. The other one you may or may not have heard of is that Brevard Zoo has expanded its reach. They've got Restore Our Shores now doing all sorts of restoration work in Brevard. They will come down and support our partners down in Indian River County when volunteers are needed. This now is a $130 million campaign. It's got about 87 million raised or pledged, but it's going to be focused on conservation. It's going to be focused on looking at the habitats that we live in, that we love, like sea turtles, like manatees, like fish. And so we're really excited to see that move, hopefully to groundbreaking, maybe later this spring. But this has been a heavy lift for Brevard. But it will be transformational. And the foundation has already pledged $1 from every ticket sale to go to cost match local restoration projects. So that'll be $500,000 a year coming from tourism for the lagoon for competitive grant programs. And that's big. That's as much as we're getting from the public sector. And then lastly, the big challenge up in Brevard County is this massive growth at Kennedy Space Center. And how do you balance, last year it was 109 launches. The year coming up, we're already in, will be 300 launches. Artemis got rolled out, rolled back, and then rolled out, rolled back. But when heavy lift hits, vibration, traffic, noise, those heavy lift rockets are really, really impactful. How do you balance this really national defense need now, with those very precious resources, Canaveral National Seashore, Mosquito Lagoon, Northern Banana River, and we're having those discussions now. And there is no easy solution to this, other than, this is inevitable, this space expansion, just like it was in the 60s, and I'm old enough to remember that. And we're trying to figure out what that looks like. So with that, I'm gonna just let you know, my world, it's not the science, it's not the money, it's why I'm here. It's why I stayed here, why I'm still here. We live in a remarkable place. The quality of life and clean water, and also the wildlife we see on any given day, makes us a remarkable place to live, work, play, retire. You can even play golf and look at manatees at the same time. You can find that anywhere else in the United States. So anyway, that's it, and I'll just answer questions. Yes.
Duane, you did a terrific job. I remember you doing your postdoc at the Florida Medical Entomology Lab.
Yeah, chasing plankton and mosquito impoundments with Dr. Jorge Ray.
Exactly.
You're aging us,
But what your point here is that we need to save our lagoon, the fishes, and the birds, because they will save us. I mean, we're going to be in trouble if that lagoon goes bad.
You want to see a cool quote? I think I put it in. This is a gentleman who's building the most, I would say, advanced, high-tech fishing, small inshore fishing vessels anywhere in the world. Hells Bay Boat Works, their manufacturing is in Titusville. 16-foot skiff I couldn't afford. If I took every dollar I have. You know, it's amazing how much boats cost these days. He can't make a living and keep his crew working, you know, unless we've got fishable clean waters. And he and his wife are major supporters of Cats for Clean Water down south, but it's those industries that actually are the stakeholders, and their families, their workers, absolutely live and die by the quality of this lagoon. So you're right, Dick, it's direct impact, but it's also quality of life impact. Yes?
First off, thank you. So I just get so inspired by all the work that you and your team do. And I grew up here, and it's fun to think back, you know, what it was like growing up in these waters. And it's even more fun to hear from people who have been here double the length that I've been and family generations. And one thing that I've been really curious on is if there was a point in which the lagoon was at its peak state, perhaps before the flood of population came, larger manufacturing, et cetera, was there a peak state that we could almost go back to, not just to think about the water clarity, but from the water quality standpoint, to almost reverse engineer those certain elements of nitrogen, phosphorus, thinking about different nutrient loads so that we can understand what would cultivate the most ideal scenario?
The answer is probably no. And pre-Clean Water Act, you know, most of our utilities were direct discharging into the lagoon for decades. And you go all the way back, I mean way back to the, you know, the Eyes Indians, for example. You know, we don't know what that condition was. You know, inlets weren't stable. Some of the inlets didn't exist. You know, it was with more fresh water. You know, there's some geological evidence that this system has changed. There's a scientist that some of you probably have met before, Bob Bernstein. I remember 35 years ago, and he's a seagrass expert, now retired. He said, you know, because it's narrow, it's shallow, it's got this really complicated watershed, you know, this system is going to confound our understanding, you know, because we don't really have a historic target. And even if we had a historic target, so you saw seagrass abundance back in 2008-9 that increased. The backstory was while seagrasses were increasing for the decade before, so was macroalgae. And so some of the clarity we saw back then was because macroalgae was the sponge for nutrients. And then all of a sudden a whole bunch of stuff happened in 10 and 11, including a dramatic freeze. The macroalgae died off quickly. All those nutrients hit the water column, and all these tiny little plankton were ready to suck it up. And they had all the stuff. They had all the nutrients, all the micronutrients, the clear water. And so there's a lot of scientific publications. One I really liked, it was a modeling where they said, I don't remember the exact title, but it was, you know, Return to Neverland. So what we remember probably is not going to be attainable, but what is attainable, and we've seen it at Puget Sound, we've seen it in Chesapeake Bay, and it doesn't, you don't turn it and then walk away. This is like a constant commitment to stewardship and restoration and recovery, especially with 800 people coming into Florida today. But what we can do is set some targets, and we are doing that. You know, so it's fishable, swimmable, and that's my theory. It's not scientific. You know, is it safe to swim for your grandkids? Are the fish and the shellfish safe to eat? And you know, those two are really important parameters. And is the system, it's never going to be stable like some of these larger, heavily flush systems. But when you look over, let's say, a decade, you have some level of stability, and that stability is going to be seagrasses. And so robust seagrass coverage, not, you know, what I would call this episodic, you know, boom and bust environment. And there's a way to get to that, and it's nutrient reduction. and that's going to be stormwater, wastewater, muck dredging. That'll get us part of the way there, and then you're going to restore the pieces of the puzzle that we lost. So if you ask me, can we ever have redfish the way I remember when I got here? I remember fly casting, and I was terrible at fly casting. It was brand new. It was like this. Lucky the guy didn't die. There are 400 tails in front of me in Mosquito Lagoon, and you just had to drop a fly and have the right fly that they take. And that's, I don't think, comes back. I don't even know if that was natural. But, you know, animals have a tendency to go where there's good water and good food, and abundant food. When I got here, there were hardly any manatees, like 2,000, you know, and we're fluctuating between 6 and 8. And so, yeah, the answer is I wish I had a better baseline to target. And so the key here is, you know, one target, fewer harmful algal blooms, less intense, lower duration, and then seagrass recovery, and a decrease in macroalgae being replaced by seagrass. But yeah, that's a tough one. I wish, you know, when William Beebe and all those guys from Audubon, Dick knows the crew that used to come down to the South Beaches and hang out at Ma Latham's old oak lodge. It's too bad they didn't take data. What they did do is shoot an awful lot of birds and also take a lot of them back to the museum, but they also fished. And if you hear the stories, you know, it was remarkably diverse and abundant, you know, where, you know, there's a story, and I've got to find it, so I was going to try to find it for today, where one of the locals in Titusville, one of the founders, rowed his boat over to some of the islands just off of Titusville by Banana Creek. He fished, and within less than an hour had all he needed for his family. Thought he'd bring some ducks home, and as he was rowing back to Titusville, loaded his, I think it was a, you know, double barrel. I don't know if it was side to side or top to bottom. He didn't know what direction to shoot. Because in any direction at 360 degrees, he was hitting like 10 birds with pellets. Those days, I don't think we're going to see those days again. The system's different, the climate's different, the development's different, the stressors are so much more now. But a really good question. And if you want a copy of that, you know, Return to Neverland, I'll send it to you. Just shoot me an email. Yes?
What is the status of the reservoirs being built around Lake Okeechobee to capture the discharge of nutrients rather than having them flow east into the Indian River Lagoon?
So this is an interesting long game story. So we've been doing Everglades restoration for every bit of 4 decades, maybe more. And so what's exciting now over the last 10 years is that finally there's enough money on the table to do the work of those large, they call them STAs, stormwater treatment areas. And the idea is to move the water south. Some of that water has to go west to the Caloosahatchee. That was a natural connection. But this connection to St. Lucie River, to St. Lucie Estuary, to Southern Lagoon, that connection was never there. That was a human-built connection. Now, there was watershed connections, but not, you know, what I would call direct discharge and flow. The big challenge there is now you have so much growth down there. You got agriculture wanting and needing water. You got Miami-Dade and also Southwest Florida drawing water. And we, as environmental folks, want to hold that water back, retain it, and what level is appropriate with the Hoover Dike right now, which is very low, by the way. This drought has got water levels low where agriculture is really worried. Now they've got a double hit with this freeze. Now you've got competing interests on water resources. So Drew Bartlett, who's the executive director of South Florida Water Management District, has done an amazing job with this federal and state funding to move those projects forward, and especially C23, C24, it's called IRL South, C25. A lot of that was flowing directly into the Southern Lagoon. So the key is hold it, treat it, And if you hold it and treat it, you know, you can use it somewhere. And a couple of years ago, actually, somebody in Vero Beach, you know, who has lots of land, they were looking at what's called dispersed water management. And that could be on public or private lands where you use large natural wetlands. In this case, most of it is farmland that's not farmed, and actually farm water to hold it back. Very expensive, can be controversial, but I say now, you got two choices. If you have agriculture sitting on 8,000 acres, and you know it's not really high quality wildlife, you know, habitat, you could restore it to high quality wildlife. That's one option. Super expensive, super hard. Outcomes are hard to predict. You can take advantage of that property and use it for water storage and treatment. And then build these private, public, or public-public relationships. And Dick was involved. You know, do you want it owned by the public? Do you want it owned by a private entity? My personal opinion is I don't care. What I don't want is 10,000 rooftops, which is the terminal crop for that amount of acreage, and a golf course and a gated community. I don't have anything against that, but not in the Everglades watershed. The damage is already extreme. So yeah, we need to be holding water back, treating it, and then managing the release. And there's some really good projects. Crane Creek, C10, you know, that they stage that water west through multiple reservoirs before they discharge to the St. John's. And it's not coming straight to the lagoon. But you know, we're trying to recreate what nature gave us free, because we weren't thinking about any of this in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even the 80s. And so, you know, it's like anything. It's like if you have a boat, you don't maintain your boat, only two things can happen. It's going to sink on you, which happens more than it should, or you're going to have to put so much money into repairing the boat, you could have bought a new boat for the sweat equity and the cost of trying to get an old, beat-up boat back, you know, into shape. Yes?
So you brought up muck dredging, which I think is super interesting, and Brevard has done a good amount of work on that. We haven't really seen that here, and I'm curious, what are some of the pros and cons of muck dredging?
One of the cons is it's expensive. One of the cons is that it takes a lot of time. You know, it's hydraulic dredging, not like what we knew up north or down in the Mississippi with claw dredges. There is a big debate, which I think has been answered by science, but not some of the general public, that, you know, we're just dredging up harmful chemicals and materials like heavy metals. That's not the case. They test for all of that. So it's really the management. And what's really interesting about muck dredging, it's not the dredging itself, but how do you manage it once you have it? It's 90% water, so you have to de-water it. If you come up the causeway on Pineda, if you're going north, going west, it'll be on your left. If you're going east, it'll be on your right. You'll see this staging area with trucks and 100-foot, you know, geotubes. If you don't have the land, it's really slow to drive, and you can't put in a truck on the highway, you know, if it's still wet, because you're going to cause a problem. And I have done that before, by the way, when I was with industry. But there's compelling information that Brevard County has. That number one, we have a lot of nutrient flux, and also we call low oxygen, anaerobic, and anoxic conditions in muck. You can't grow anything in muck because it's low pH. And the idea is you have to have really good dredge companies. You can't just, you know, if it's 5 feet deep, you can't do 3 feet and think you've made a change. The muck flux is actually based on area, not volume and depth. So we're really lucky. There is an expert, in fact, Mike mentioned it when he was introducing me, who was a grad student with Dr. John Treffery, who I still call Dr. Muck. But his doctoral student, who is now a professor at Florida Tech, is like Dr. Muck generation 2. Austin Fox knows more about muck flux. We just funded another project, the 5th year, and they are doing some of the, what I call state-of-the-art work and what happens in those sediments. And if any of you have farmed, whether it's citrus, sugarcane, row crops, ornamentals, soil is everything. How that soil interacts with the ball of the plant. I worked for a landscaper when I was a kid up in Long Island. We used to plant oak trees, mature oak trees in estates on Long Island, and the balls on those trees were like as big as that whole side of the room. And you'd have flatbeds and giant equipment, because if it was any smaller, that tree would suffer because it doesn't have the rhizome. I'm convinced seagrass is exactly the same. And getting muck out of the system, absolutely imperative. And the hypothesis that he just shared, just in the last month, is if you've got, like out here, you got deep areas that don't have any muck because they have water flow. So it's not going to settle where you have good water flow. But you have these holes, dredge holes, some of the areas along the shorelines of spoil islands. And he's got pretty compelling information now that where muck winds up on flats is that it fills up those deeper holes and starts to spill over like a garbage can that's full. And you start seeing muck sheet flowing into areas where you look around and say, well, where is that coming from? And so the efficiency will be in technology, both drying and dredging. But the other efficiency is you don't have to dredge muck everywhere. Look for the hot spots, the deep spots, and dredge it back to native sediment. And it's going to flux anyway for a while, but you can get a lot of purchase with dredging. And Brevard's got data on that. But it's a hard thing to sell. And if you're a neighbor near a muck dredge, nobody's happy for the couple of years. You got pumps and pipes, and they don't smell bad, but everybody is so afraid of, potential impacts. And if you want to see that one, they're dredging right now on Grand Canal along Satellite and Indian Harbor Beach. They've been at it for, I want to say maybe 4 years. They got a lot of work to do. It's a slow process.
Thank you.
Yes.
Duane, I request for clarification. You identified the value or economic benefits associated with clarification. Are those annual benefits?
Okay, good point. So with the NOAA project specifically, the BCRs, Balmoral ran those out 10 years, the benefit cost ratio, and the logic behind that, which we bought, we thought, that's a better way to look at it. If I'm going to restore, like we're doing at Begum, if I'm going to do a restoration and planting, you're not going to get those benefits in the first year. So what's the appropriate time? And so most ecosystem restoration is looking at 5 or 10 years. Everything else, so the roll-up, that $10 billion in ecosystem services, that's annual. The $28.3 billion in economic output, that's annual. Yes?
Duane, thank you for your long-term perspective. When I think of the Indian River Lagoon, I think of really the overall health of the Florida Peninsula, because so much of the peninsula flows into the IRL through rivers, Lake Okeechobee, etc. My question is the concept of making the lagoon a national park, where that could happen through an executive order from the president. However, a more effective way to do it is through congressional approval. And that requires education not only within Florida, but within the United States on how important the lagoon is. I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are around having retention like that. There are pluses and minuses, of course.
So I'll go back to the business line to mine. If you look at our national parks in America, they're understaffed, they're underfunded. They have been. It wasn't just this administration. This is decades of insufficient funding. I don't think having a national park dedicated for the whole Indian River Lagoon, or even part of it, is worth the effort. What I do think, and I've thrown this on the table, that we've got Biscayne Bay, no national significance. Perdido, Pensacola, looks like they're going to join the National Estuary Program network. But we're underfunded. $850,000 a year for these 28 estuaries is a joke. Chesapeake Bay, and this changes from year to year typically, and they're in a different program. They're considered large geographic programs, either congressionally mandated like Everglades, or through EPA in their, it's called a large geographic program. Puget Sound on average is getting $50 million a year. Chesapeake Bay got one year, a couple of years ago, they asked for like 85 and got 95. Of course, that was a different administration. And so I think we have all of the tools, both regulatory and non-regulatory, to get to where we want. And adding another designation just confuses Congress. And it doesn't bring the money we need to actually do this work. And so, yeah, I'm not a big fan of, layering another label on it, unless it's going to bring significant money. And so what I threw on, this is 2017, and I won't tell you which offices. I said, I got an idea. It's a big idea. I just want your thoughts. And there were no thoughts. They just kind of went. But I said, why don't we take every estuary in the state of Florida, those that are already in the National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is 3, I think. We've got 4 national estuary programs, now a 5th coming online, maybe, if there's funding. We've got aquatic preserves in the lagoon, which is over, I forget how many APs we have. Then we have these estuaries that very much may or may not be nationally significant like we are, but they want it because it's one of the vehicles for funding. What if we actually went back to Congress and said, we're going to fold all this into a single large geographic program? And I laid it out, who would get what. So I did a pro forma without asking anybody's permission, which is, what do I care? I'm old, been fighting cancer, fireman. And I thought everybody would win. We would double the annual amount of money for each of the NEPs, to $2 million instead of $850,000. And we would be going in as a state level effort rather than doing this Sarasota Bay. We're in the same group, but they're all different. National Estuarine Research Reserves, or NOAA, over in Interior, we're in EPA. And so 40 to 50 million would actually, everybody would benefit. So Lake Worth Lagoon, would have money from the feds. Biscayne Bay would have money from the feds. St. Joe Bay, who wants to be an NEP, money from the feds. Couldn't get any traction. And I'm going to throw that back out now again, mainly because we're going to see a new governor next fall. But it's going to take a huge amount of effort, because the pushback is you already have Everglades. We're already putting $500 million a year. And to be honest, I don't think Washington sees each of these estuaries, which is why I show you how many federal assets we have in this system. And now these federal assets are all about space defense. It's not NASA, let's explore the world and the galaxy. This is all about defense, and it's all about China and getting to the moon. But yeah, when I look at the park system, and I'll give you 2 examples because I just talked to them. Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge has always been understaffed and underfunded. And these last cuts this last year, they have a third of the staff they had and no money almost to do the work that their mission demands, like prescribed burning, keeping trails open. So I just don't have a lot of faith that that designation's gonna get us anything that we need other than a designation. But that's just me. You know, I don't wanna be pessimistic, but I kind of look where the money is first, and then I look where the politics could happen. National parks, cool designation, but just don't see it happen.
Duane, you have a question over here?
Yeah.
Duane, I agree with you on the national parks. It's labor intensive and they're already underfunded. What do you think, since we have a patchwork of conservation areas and sanctuaries, like you said with the estuary program, folding that in together and not a national park because of the staffing and funding, and it's just too cumbersome, but sanctuary.
When you look at Preservation 2000, Forever Florida, the county's land, and you know, I was super happy when Indian River County decided they were going to start buying land again. We as a program have always respected home rule, and we've always respected that you know best on how to manage and handle, you know, your natural areas. I think the higher you get up in the totem pole of government, the more cost, less efficient, and the less control you have. So if I came into Vero Beach, I'm trying to think of, you've got a couple soccer fields, a couple baseball fields, a couple schools, and I say, because of finances, I'm gonna shut down this soccer field, all hell breaks loose, because you protect these areas for recreation, for boat access. So that's where you can do something. You need to be standing up as Vero Beach, as Indian River County, you know, for that network of restoration sites. And you have some exceptionally cool sites. You know, the Jones Pier to me is like one of the coolest places ever on the whole lagoon. I'll go down there just to catch my breath, you know, and look at that little pond. But you have stormwater ponds that should be the envy of everybody on the lagoon. Osprey is one. And in fact, your algal turf scrubber, try to find it, Dave. I think Kenny funded that back in 2009, 2010. That was state of the art, and it's still pulling nutrients. But yeah, consolidation, I think at the county level, and we do have a map, by the way, so all these projects are online, but every ecotourism and heritage site, you can go on our website and find every single one we could find throughout the lagoon, where it is, who's managing, when it's open, and if you've got a site that just opened we don't have, let us know and we'll add it to that interactive website. But yeah, I think, you know, management, and counties can be tricky, trust me. You know, I ran Brevard County's Endangered Lands Program as the first director, and there were county commissioners at the time who said I was the devil and should be hung in the street because we were taking lands off the tax rolls. It took a while to win them over, but it was pretty intense there for a while. And so the politics shifts a lot, federal, state, local. But these lands, you need to have them in perpetuity. Big argument going on in Volusia County with Volusia Forever. You know, because there's a councilman up there that thinks that recreation should be okay on some of those sites that were bought when the public said we're going to pay for these to be in conservation in perpetuity. One of the first times my board has ever sent a letter like that to a local government. And I said, you sure? Because I've always looked at our board as like the Supreme Court. Only the really big stuff do they do resolutions or letters. It's a unanimous. They said, send them a letter. You know, these lands have value. Of course, now we have the numbers. But yeah, I think you can do anything you want. You could build information to let the public know. Almost nobody knows Jones Pier exists. Of course, that might be a good thing because it's some of the neighbors probably just as soon have it local. But there's some real gems, and we have some heritage sites, African American heritage sites, that the general public doesn't really see the history and the context. City of Sebastian, that working waterfront is only a working waterfront because of a state grant. So yeah, it's what you want. I don't know what works and what doesn't, but I do know if the public doesn't support it, it gets sold off for a condominium somewhere.
Explain a lot of that in Vero Beach is because we're a charter government, and it's very easy to protect the charter protected because it takes a referendum to get it out underneath the charter.
And not all governments have that same protection, both legal and, institutionally. And you're lucky you have it. Yeah. Well, you have been very patient, sitting this long listening to a marine biologist talk about money. Any other questions? I think the bar might still be open too. Yes?
One question. Let's say the state of Florida goes no property taxes, and the funding is so limited that the government comes to you and says, you've got one project you can do. I'll give you the money for it. It's got to be the most successful project that you've ever seen with the best results you've ever had. What's that project you would do?
I'd ask a question back, and that is how much money are you putting on the table? So if it's in the tens of millions, I'd say that wastewater treatment plant to serve Kennedy Space Center and Central Brevard and Brevard Zoo Aquarium. Because that's going to deliver huge immediate benefits. But if we get even a small contraction of ad valorem tax, property tax, we're all doomed. So, and I've said this on the record, there will be no IRL council unless the feds pick up the difference. The water management districts are barely operating, what they need to now. Small communities, even affluent communities like Vero Beach, if you look at budgets, ad valorem is a very important component of both the affluent community, but if you aren't affluent, if you're agriculture, you're small, relatively poor, under capacity, I don't know how they survive, because you can't make this up. The banter up in Tallahassee when I was there, oh, you can use sales tax, you can use gas tax, you can use impact fees. You can add all of those up if you have some room to move. Because I know Indian River County is at their cap on discretionary sales tax. Brevard has left room, which is why they can run another referendum for Save Our Indian River Lagoon. You can't make up that difference. You just can't get it. And so I don't know what happens, but it will be economic chaos, my opinion. And remember, I'm a state employee. We shouldn't talk like this. It'll be not only economic chaos, it's economic negligence. It basically, we're growing at 800 people, a day on average, and that growth doesn't pay for itself.
Property tax, and it'll be more than 800.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you open this door,
It would open like a floodgate. It would look like Okeechobee flowing into.
That's exactly right. And I believe that's the strategic vision of this. It's not so much to make Florida less expensive. I'm basically a blue collar guy. I'm making decent money. I couldn't afford a house right now in Florida unless I go to Okeechobee or inland. The cost, the insurance, we have gotten expensive. So this idea that somehow ad valorem, it's like cutting your revenue out without cutting your costs. I don't know how they get there. And I'm glad I'm not a young kid with grandkids or kids, because I do not see a good economic future if you cut revenue and you're still growing. It doesn't make business sense to me. But that's just me. Remember, I'm a marine biologist. You can only take my economic advice, with more of an opinion than what I know. But I don't know anybody who's an economist who thinks this is a good idea. And I don't know anybody in the public who thinks they're overtaxed, especially if you're coming from New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. Maybe you can do a better deal in North Carolina, but North Carolina and South Carolina, cost of doing business up there is going up fast like we did. It's a challenge, and I'm worried about it. But the IRL Council, for all intents and purposes, unless we find a different model for financing, can't do any of this. We'll be out of business.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.